Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's talk by Agnieszka Joniak-Lüthi, sponsored by the Central Asia Working Group under the auspices of the Institute of East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley. This is an initiative that aims to bring Central Asia into focus by fostering campus-wide dialogue between faculty, visiting scholars, and graduate students working on the region. Before introducing the speaker, I just want to say that you can type in your questions by clicking the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. I will try and get to as many of the questions as possible at the end of the talk. For any technical issues, please use the chat tab at the bottom of the screen. Our speaker today, Agnieszka Joniak-Lüthi, is professor of social anthropology at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland and heads the team project Roadwork, an anthropology of infrastructure at China's Inner-Asian borders, founded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. She's also the current managing editor of the Platinum open access journal Roadsides. Agnieszka focuses in her research on Western China and the Sino-Central Asian border regions. She's currently particularly interested in reconsidering infrastructure through the lifespans, time horizons, and temporal rhythms of the state, capital, materials, discourses, humans, etc., that make and unmake the state, unmake the infrastructure. She's also interested in the interface at which the normative ideas about infrastructure and its functioning disintegrate into situated social practice. In her current research, she explores the tension between the fact that infrastructure incessantly decays and, on the other hand, the persistent belief in its transforming power shared by so many developmental ideologies around the world. Agnieszka is the author of The Han, China's Diverse Majority, published by the University of Washington Press in 2015, and a co-editor of the special issue Spatial Transformation in China's Northwestern Borderlands, published by the journal Inner Asia in 2016. Her articles have been published, among others, in the Journal of Asian Studies, the Cambridge Journal of Anthropology, Political Geography, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Modern Asian Studies, Asian Ethnicity, and Zeitschrift für Ethnologie. Today, her talk will focus specifically on infrastructure and travel in the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Agnieszka, welcome.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Unfortunately, I missed the webinar on Xinjiang 2 weeks ago, so I just can hope that I won't repeat too much of what's already been said. Yeah, that's my hope. So let's start. I'll try to share my screen. So as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, traveling in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in Northwest China was mostly done on sandstone and gravel roads or in a roadless terrain across the vast rock and sand deserts. Xinjiang is only a little smaller than the states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas taken together, but it is inhabited only by 22 million people. And this is due to the fact that more than 90% of Xinjiang is made up by deserts and mountains. So water is a scarce resource. Humans have traditionally lived and also live today in the oases situated at the rim of the huge deserts that make up both the centers of northern and southern Xinjiang. People settled there where the water coming down from the mountains made irrigated agriculture possible. On this map of southern Xinjiang, you see that the interior of the region is made up by the Taklamakan Desert, and the oasis cities such as Korla, Kucha, Aksu, Kashgar, and Hotan, and Charklik are all situated at the rim of the desert. The Muslim Uyghurs, who number around 10 million, are the largest ethnic population in Xinjiang. The second largest are the Han Chinese with nearly 9 million. The numbers that you see in this table make clear that most of the Han Chinese in Xinjiang are either settlers themselves or descendants of those who settled in the region after 1949, when the Chinese People's Republic with Xinjiang in its borders was established. In 1949, as you see, the Han made up only around 6% of the region's population. Today, they are the significant 40%. Other ethnic groups inhabiting the region are the Dongans, Kazakhs, Mongols, Russian, Kyrgyz, and Tibetans. Xinjiang is, of course, geopolitically of utmost importance to China because it borders 8 countries, among others, Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and importantly, India. As you all know, Xinjiang has been a restive region. Many of the Uyghurs and other non-Han expressed discontent with how the region has been managed by the Chinese government since 1949. The massive resettlement of Han Chinese from Eastern China or Central China to Xinjiang, which I mentioned since the 1950s, is a great source of resentment. So is, of course, the introduction of the Chinese language as the only language of instruction in schools, a project that was launched about a decade ago and I believe is accomplished by now. Further, also the ways in which Xinjiang's resources such as natural gas, oil, coal, uranium, and potash are exploited for the Chinese national economy without any concern for the local population and for the ecosystems, there are a cause for resentment too. So the list of points of tension is long, as is the list of violent unrest in the region. Following the infrastructure investment related to various government-led development programs since the year 2000 and the Belt and Road Initiative, which was launched in 2013, many thousands of kilometers of roads and railways have been built and upgraded despite this volatile social political situation. As you see on this slide, the total length of roads in Xinjiang increased from 33,000 kilometers in 1999 to 186,000 in 2017, and is probably now much higher than that. And then the total length of expressways, you see the numbers too, 1998, 170 kilometers, 2017, 4,578 kilometers, and today probably around 7,000. Railroads, have expanded at a slower pace than highways, but still in southern Xinjiang, which you see on this map, the loop around the Taklamakan Desert is nearly complete, as is the connection eastwards to the Tibetan province of Qinghai, where the railway network connects with the national train network. In the nomenclature of the Belt and Road Initiative, Xinjiang is a corridor that should facilitate the flows of goods between Eastern China and the Eurasian continent. Xinjiang is thus crucial to the initiative as a gateway to the westward land and sea routes that should connect China with Central Asia, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, more generally Europe and Africa. In maps of Xinjiang, the new and upgraded roads and railways are cartographically represented as neat, continuous lines, apparently available to all in the same way. Also in another realm of representation, such as the websites of the China Road and Bridge Corporation, China State Construction, and other state-owned companies, we are confronted with this kind of images of beautiful open roads stretching off to the horizon. As with maps, no human or animal presence disturbs these clear lines and their geometricity. But of course, the everyday practice of travel is significantly more complex than what such images and cartographic representations suggest. For example, the maps and official images never show the thousands of police roadblocks or checkpoints that exist along these new smooth roads, sometimes even preceding their construction. Though Xinjiang as a restive border region has never been roadblock or checkpoint free, they have truly proliferated in the last decade, and especially after 2013. Roadblocks are located at county borders, on access roads to cities and towns, along border roads, expressways, provincial roads, and even village roads. These various roadblocks differ in their appearance. Sometimes they are simply a rope spread across the road between two chairs on which the policemen or the militia sit and control the traffic. At other locations, like here, they are firmly inscribed in the place and marked by barriers, roadside shelters, and buildings. The task of the roadblocks is to classify the travelers into those who are allowed to move along the state-built roads and those who are not. The three key criteria according to which people are classified at the roadblocks are their nationality or minzu, their household registration, hukou, and the paternal ancestral origin, ji. Being of Muslim nationality, having a rural household registration, and paternal ancestral origin in southern Xinjiang makes traveling very difficult, if not impossible. It is relatively easy to pass the checks for Han Chinese living in Xinjiang or for the Han Chinese migrants from inner China, also because very few of them have a local rural household registration. Most Han in Xinjiang live in cities and towns, or on the farms of the production and construction corps, many of which have been granted urban household registration over the past decade. Because an overwhelming majority of the Han Chinese in Xinjiang are settlers and migrants, also their ancestral origin is outside Xinjiang. Those who typically remain on the sieve or need a long time to pass the checks are thus Muslims with ancestral origin in Xinjiang and rural household registration. These are the people that the government wants to keep away from the new roads and makes their mobility very difficult. Thus, the nationality or ethnicity to a certain degree of an individual, their household registration and paternal origin have a determining impact on where, how far, and how quickly an individual is effectively able to travel. In 2015, 2 years after the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, whose declared aim is to facilitate mobility, the control of movement in Xinjiang intensified further with the introduction of the so-called convenient citizen cards, 边民卡 in Chinese, for all those with paternal ancestry in Xinjiang. So anyone wishing to travel beyond the immediate vicinity of the villages or towns had to apply for this card at the local government first and be granted it in order to travel. Otherwise, this person would be stopped at the first checkpoint. Together with the introduction of the convenient citizen cards, also the rigidity of the checks and the presence of heavily armed police has increased. Even between my research stays in 2015 and 2016, the change was significant. Since then, the proliferation of roadblocks outside of urban areas has been paralleled by construction of police stations at nearly every crossing in cities, towns, and villages, omnipresent surveillance cameras, and regular iris ID and mobile phone scans at the entrance to almost all buildings like schools, universities, or shopping centers. After the appointment of Tran Guo as the party secretary of Xinjiang in 2016, restrictions on mobility for the Muslim population ramped up further as have their mass detention in camps and prisons and other forms of exclusion and state violence. Also, my Uyghur research partners from geography and anthropology departments at Xinjiang University have either been disappeared or have been under house arrest for the past years. Among them are Raila Dawood, who was, I guess, mentioned 2 weeks ago, an Uyghur professor of cultural anthropology, who has been missing since, I think, 2017. Then there is my colleague Saud Pawan, an anthropologist who did his PhD at the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology in Halle in Germany. And my main research partner, Ümit Halik, professor of geography, whose wife and son were detained in a re-education camp, I think, in 2018, and he was put under house arrest. So the list is long, and I'm sure my predecessors 2 weeks ago have discussed this dramatic situation at length. The people that I know are just a few examples of by now around 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz who have been disappeared or illegally detained in re-education camps and prisons over the past 4 years. So what does it mean in terms of transport infrastructure, mobility, and travel? The situation could not be more paradoxical. The investment in transport infrastructures in Xinjiang over the past decade has been huge, and so the infrastructure to potentially go anywhere is in place. However, few Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other members of Muslim ethnic populations of nearly 12 million people are actually able to travel. In addition to those who cannot move because they are imprisoned or are in re-education camps, others are basically incarcerated in their villages and towns and not free to journey on any kind of road, whether old and potholed or new asphalted and shiny. But it is not really this and other paradoxes that I want to explore today. Instead, I would like to focus on a related but different phenomenon at the intersection of ethnicity or nationality and transport infrastructure, namely on the association of infrastructure in Xinjiang with quasi-ethnic identities, and on the ways in which travel is embroiled in discourses and performances of ethnicity. I draw on material collected during my 10 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Xinjiang in 2011 and 12, and a pair of 2-month research visits in 2015 and 16. During my research, I focused on the Uyghur-dominated southern Xinjiang. I conducted around 400 conversations about infrastructure and travel with Uyghur and Chinese, Han Chinese interlocutors. I also regularly traveled using various means of transport, such as trains, sleeper buses, collective taxis, cabs, and private cars of my research participants, as well as those belonging to my Uyghur and Han colleagues. The aim of this ethnography on the road was to get an insight into the mobility practices of my research participants in addition to listening to their stories. So I tried to learn about travel through different eyes: Han and Uyghur villages, government officials, business people, migrants, and students. I also extensively walked along roads, and both being the passenger and walking were crucial in order to experience the realities of travel with my own body. For example, to experience the sense of insecurity at the police checkpoint, or the smoothness of the asphalt after a long bumpy ride through the desert. Also, the feeling of my shoe soles melting on an asphalt road across the Taklamakan desert, similarly to the tires of those few trucks that dared to drive it during the day. This was most insightful. New roads and railways in Xinjiang, as elsewhere in the world, are often advertised in state and corporate language as harbingers of development, modernity, and prosperity for all. Xinjiang's roadsides and highway bridges are stuck with huge banners stating, for example, if you want to become wealthy, build a road first. Or the more poetic, when roads are built, feelings can connect. When roads are built, wealth can travel along them. Also, Mr. Abdulkarim, one of my government interlocutors who drove me around the oasis town of Korla, said in a similar turn of phrase. The plan of the government is to connect all villages by roads and to link them to water pipelines and TV broadcasting. Look, this road was a dirt track until recently. Now it is paved. See how convenient it has become. There is a saying in Uyghur, if you want wealth to come, first build a road. When there are no roads, people can't connect. Roads bring education, economic development. Look, there is a taxi in front of us. Previously, there were no taxis in the countryside. No taxi would come down here. The roads were too bad. It has become so convenient now. People can go to the bazaar, sell their products. Now the government cares about the countryside. The countryside used to have only dirt roads and the towns had asphalt. Now it's the same for all. The differences were evened out. Everybody has asphalt now. Interestingly, the two sayings, if you want wealth to come, first build a road, and then when there are no roads, people can't connect. He said both of them in Chinese. In the slogans and in the statement by Mr. Abdulkarim, technologies such as roads and railways are represented as clean objects, separated from the politics of the everyday and unaffected by the historical, social, and political terrain in which they are embedded. If agentive, they are thought of as having effects that can be clearly delineated and defined. For example, they bring wealth, develop the local economy, or bring education. In contrast to such clean understanding of technology, I suggest thinking infrastructure, such as roads, as places in which specific social relations intersect and accumulate over time, forming unique social, material, political terrain. For the purpose of today's talk, I draw on this idea of mine, as well as on the proposition by Harvey, Jensen, and Morita to think infrastructure as extended material assemblages that generate effects and structure social relations, either through engineered or non-engineered activities. So I consider infrastructure as an accumulation of social, political, cultural, material relations that affect individual experience of it. This helps me make sense of the research material that I will present in a minute. Harvey, Jensen, and Morita, on the other hand, emphasized a different aspect of infrastructure. They emphasized that the engineered effects of infrastructure, or in other words, what infrastructure is expected to do, are important, but rarely outnumber the flurry of unforeseen and unplanned effects and resonances that every infrastructure generates in everyday life. Ethnicization of infrastructure, that is ascription of ethnic identities to buses and trains and roads and railways in Xinjiang, which I will discuss, is one such unplanned and unforeseen resonance. In regions ridden with ethnic conflict, infrastructures rarely escape unscathed. In southern Xinjiang, one of the topics that came up frequently in conversations about travel by both Uyghur and Han was their preference for one or another means of transport. The debate centered on trains as opposed to buses. I was told by the overwhelming majority of my Han Chinese interlocutors that they preferred to travel by train rather than long distance or sleeper bus. The buses in southern Xinjiang were considered by them dirty, Tang, and inconvenient, 不方便. The majority of Uyghur interlocutors, on the other hand, emphasized that they preferred, exactly on the contrary, going by bus. They found buses clean and convenient and trains dirty and inconvenient. Inconvenient, or 不方便 in Chinese, which was used by both Han and Uyghur, is a polite word that in this case indicates situations that feel awkward and are not in accordance with popular norms as to what is proper or right. Remarkably, also a few of my Han Chinese interlocutors who had grown up in southern Xinjiang in multi-ethnic communities explicitly stated, like many Uyghurs, that they enjoyed traveling by long-distance buses. There were some gender and class differences in those preferences too. For example, middle-class Uyghurs and Han expressed a preference for planes or for driving own car. State employees who can reimburse train tickets but not bus tickets highlighted also the comfort of train rides. And for young, unmarried Uyghur women traveling alone for work or study, planes were considered morally the least ambiguous environment and were thus preferred. Actual use of transport was much more diverse and flexible than the discourse about it, and decisions regarding actual travel were made rather pragmatically depending on the concrete situation. All differences in the actual ways of traveling notwithstanding, the opinions articulated were clear. When asked about their preferences, most of the Han Chinese interlocutors argued that trains were better than buses because they were comfortable and clean, 干净. The majority of my Uyghur research participants claimed, very much on the contrary, that sleeper and other long-distance buses were fast, comfortable, and clean. I prepared an excerpt from a conversation with an Uyghur driver of a collective taxi during a 6-hour ride between the city of Kashgar and the town of Tashkorgan at the border to Pakistan as one example of this broadly circulating idea. So I asked him, how do you usually travel? And the driver said, I drive my own car. This is the most convenient way. When you are tired, you can stop and sleep. You don't have to travel with many people. I hate trains. Trains are so crowded. There are so many people. They smell so bad. Earlier trains used to be really stinky. Many Han people traveled by train. Now it is better. Trains became cleaner, but all the same, I don't like them. Buses are better than trains. There are fewer people. They are less crowded. So this extract shows the typical course of many conversations. We usually started with actual practices, after which things would take a spontaneous turn to the discussion of preferences. This conversation was also characteristic in how it mapped notions of purity and dirtiness onto transport infrastructures. These notions also manifest in the next conversation, which took place between a Han Chinese businessman from Eastern China and an Uyghur bus driver. The Han businessman was on his virgin journey through Xinjiang to prospect for business opportunities. This Han man and I were sitting at the front of the bus, entertaining our Uyghur driver with conversation to basically keep him awake during the monotonous 7-hour ride through the Taklamakan desert. And the conversation among the three of us drifted between various topics. We had a lot of time to talk, as you can imagine. But one of the topics that surfaced was, of course, transportation. And so the Han businessman said, I came to Xinjiang by plane. When I first arrived, it was difficult. There are many Uyghurs here. I wasn't used to that. At the beginning, I had problems standing the way Uyghurs smell, for instance, like our bus driver. And the Uyghur bus driver replied, for you, our washing habits are difficult to accept. For us, other things are difficult to accept. For example, we don't dare to travel by train. You, Han, do everything in one place there. Eat, pee, shit, use your hands without washing them. For us, this is insupportable. We find it disgusting. And this was a perfectly amiable, friendly conversation. And after a while, the conversation moved to the next topic. And at the end of the journey, the driver and the businessman exchanged their business cards and promises of some kind of future business opportunities. The statement of the driver illustrates the disgust that many Uyghurs show towards the spatial arrangement of the train, which they understood as violating the Islamic spatial ideal that demands that the toilet should be separated from the living quarters. This rule, of course, is not reflected in the uniform China-wide train wagon design. In long-distance buses, on the other hand, which in southern Xinjiang are largely owned and operated by Uyghurs, the onboard toilets are usually unused and typically refunctioned into additional luggage space. A few days after the conversation on the bus, I interviewed a Uyghur teacher in the oasis of Hotan. When asked how he travels to the regional capital, Urumqi, a journey that takes about 24 hours by bus and about 37 hours by train, Mr. Ablimit said, "When I was a student, I went to Urumqi by train twice. Every other time, I went by bus. I liked traveling by long-distance bus. There were many students on the bus, many beautiful girls too. I didn't like trains. It was very narrow and you were so close to people you didn't know. There were many Han on the train who ate their foods and smelled strange. Now I usually fly." Many Uyghur interviewees in southern Xinjiang, with the exception of the very small minority used to driving their own cars or flying, like Mr. Ablimit, regarded long-distance buses as comfortable and convenient. With regard to trains, opinions were, of course, diametrically different. As already mentioned, some Uyghur research participants argued that the spatial arrangement on trains was unacceptable, that they were full of unfamiliar people, and that the food served and consumed on trains smelled strangely. But also other elements converged in this idea of discomfort and inconvenience they felt. Consider, for example, this statement from Mrs. Raihan, an elderly Uyghur woman, a government employee at the time of our conversation. I asked, "Do you fly when you travel in Xinjiang?" And Mrs. Raihan said, "Yes, I do, but I tell you that is not a nice thing. There are only Han Chinese on the plane, no one to talk to. That is why I like traveling by long-distance bus. You can chat, you can ask the drivers to stop for praying, and they may do it. Of course, they also follow a timetable, but it is much more flexible. Uyghurs like to travel by bus. On the train, we feel uncomfortable. On the train, everything is in Chinese. All the announcements are in Chinese, and food is not halal." When we saw each other sometime later, Mrs. Raihan asked me, "Do you know this little mocking rhyme from back in the day? It went like this. As soon as the train signal sounds, Han migrants arrive in Xinjiang. A pole and 2 baskets on their shoulders, they loudly cry, 'Come and buy baby chickens for only 1 kwai and 3 cents.'" Mrs. Raihan recounted that this verse was popular in the 1960s when the railway from Eastern China first reached Xinjiang. She found that it revealed that from the beginning, trains in Xinjiang were associated with migration from Eastern China, not only by the Uyghurs, but also by local Han. She said, "This rhyme is originally in Chinese. It was invented by the local Han Chinese who, like us, didn't like the new migrants." This association between the railway and Han Chinese migration to and settlement in Xinjiang still prevails. The conversation with Mrs. Adalet, an elderly Uyghur woman from a small town in Aksu, a small town of Aksu in southern Xinjiang, offers an example of how this association is typically made. So Mrs. Adalet said, Aksu has had a train line for a bit more than a decade. Since then, many Han started to come. I asked, and before that, were they not coming by bus? And she replied, no, there were very few of them. I don't know why. Maybe they like to come in large groups by train. They always follow the train line. My Han Chinese research participants associated trains with Han spaces as well, but their observation of this connection between railways and Han migration was not accompanied by signs of frustration, as was usually the case with the Uyghurs. For example, I once inquired why I so frequently failed to purchase train tickets. They always seemed to be sold out. And Mrs. Xie, the Han owner of a bookstore which I frequented, she replied, in September, it is difficult to buy train tickets because Han cotton pickers are coming to Xinjiang from other provinces. The government even reserves them whole trains from their place of origin to Xinjiang. About 300,000 people are needed every year for the cotton picking season. Next, there is the October national holiday, and train tickets are again hard to get hold of. Millions of migrant workers all over China travel home for a holiday, including those in Xinjiang. Then, in November and December, the cotton pickers and construction workers go back to their home provinces for winter, and train tickets are once again sold out. Tickets are similarly impossible to come by around the Chinese New Year in January or February. And Mrs. Xie seriously suggested to me that if I wanted to travel by train, then it was best to do it in March, before the Han seasonal migrants arrived in Xinjiang to commence their work in agriculture and construction. For my Han interviewees, this connection between Han migration and trains was not uncomfortable, quite on the contrary. They discussed the trains as the technology which made Xinjiang feels less empty to them. Trains brought familiar people, that is, other Han, to the region. It populated Xinjiang with familiar people. For the Uyghurs, although the association of the railway with the Chinese state and Han immigration was evident, actual experiences of travel by train were not uniformly negative. Especially some state-employed Uyghurs, as I mentioned, considered trains highly convenient, or fangbian. For example, during one of our conversations, Mr. Islam said, you know, Uyghurs like to go to Urumqi, the capital of the region. It has 30 higher education institutions. They also head to inner China to do business, or to northern Xinjiang. With the train, it's very convenient. I either take the train or fly. I am a teacher, I can reimburse it. Train is much more convenient than long-distance bus. On the train, it is convenient to make namaz, or to pray, and to read. There is a toilet, it is clean, there is more space. I mean, in the sleeper compartment, I always take the sleeper. On the bus, you can just lie down, you cannot read, it's bumpy and the air is bad. It is also not convenient for praying. Actual experiences of train travel are to a certain extent class specific. They also depend on employment, whether state or private, and also on gender. Nonetheless, the general sense of insecurity relating to the social political changes of which the expanding railway is a sign, the sense of insecurity was not absent from the stories of people like Mr. Islam either. A feeling of uneasiness about what the augmented infrastructure investment and expanding transport networks will bring for the Uyghurs accompanied nearly every conversation. The discussions were permeated by a diffuse feeling that the railway, much more straightforwardly than roads, was part of a political project. This political project for Uyghurs was palpable in daily life, in the growing frequency of undesired approximations. They observed more and more Han migrants, Han shops and restaurants, and the Chinese language moving into previously Uyghur spaces, bringing Han closer to the Uyghurs than many of the latter actually wished. So, to conclude, political and business actors advertise roads and railways in Xinjiang, built in Xinjiang in the framework of the BRI and other development campaigns, as clean objects devoid of identity, as bundles of potentialities that generate planned effects of developing this or that. But my research shows that those objects are inherently enmeshed in the processes of ethnicity and in the tense debates on who Xinjiang belongs to, who should be allowed to live there, and in what way. From the example of Israel and the Palestinian territories, perhaps best, we know that infrastructure in places ridden with ethno-national conflicts are usually embroiled in those conflicts. They can be built in specific ways to separate, to discriminate, or to bypass, like the Israeli West Bank wall or the wall at the US-Mexico border. They can also bypass specific settlements, as Madeleine Reeves has described for Kyrgyzstan, for the Tajik-Kyrgyz border. My aim today was not to focus on the materiality of a specific infrastructure, but to highlight how every infrastructure tends to have a superfluity of meaning that exceeds its normal function and intended effects. This is because every infrastructure, upon its design and construction, enters a dense terrain of social relationships that have accumulated over time. These accumulations are place and time specific, and they affect the perception and uses of specific infrastructures. Sometimes they manifest in, for example, the association of buses and trains with quasi-ethnic identities. The ethnicization of transport infrastructure is one of the unplanned resonances created by the merging of transport technologies with the specific social political history of southern Xinjiang. Another such infrastructural resonance is the exclusion of the many Muslim inhabitants from the access to state-built roads and mobility. The government advertised purpose of infrastructure to connect and distribute wealth equally. And what those roads actually do in southern Xinjiang are far apart. The categories of individuals, commodities, information, and capital permitted to travel along the roads and railways in Xinjiang are strictly defined and monitored by the state. Many of the Turkic, Muslim, and in particular rural population are excluded from this freedom of circulation. So the Uyghurs in southern Xinjiang are today stuck in very different ways than even a decade ago, when roads were in a much worse condition, but people were freer to move and there were not government disappeared individuals in nearly every family. The photographs of empty roads presented on the website of Chinese state-owned construction companies, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, may thus ironically be taken as an actual illustration of the many exclusion enacted in relation to transport infrastructure in Xinjiang. It appears that in the post-2016 reality, if not for thousands of trucks bringing in Chinese commodities from central China to Xinjiang and to Xinjiang's borders with Central Asia, and then in turn taking Xinjiang's resources to inner China, Xinjiang's expressways would be nearly empty. Thus, paradoxically, the more highways and railways that are built, the less people living in the region appear to be actually able to travel along them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnieszka, for this wonderful talk, and beautiful pictures as well. I find before we get to the questions, I just have one comment to say about this emptiness. The way these roads are portrayed, with the empty, without people, and actually even the landscapes are quite bleak. It also gives this impression that there is nothing in Xinjiang, right? It's more like a road, something to go through, rather than really a connection. So it kind of, although these roads are seen as connecting people, there's no people, and there seems to be very few things to connect. It's kind of an interesting, I don't know whether you have anything to say to that, whether we can move on to questions. Yeah. Let me get to some of the questions that we... Yes, sure. If you actually have something to say, that'd be great. Yeah.
This is basically the the dominant Chinese narrative about Xinjiang. So there is nothing to stop for in Xinjiang in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is what I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that Xinjiang is in the nomenclature of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a corridor, so it's not a place worth stopping or staying for a while. It's a place that you want to get through as quickly as possible. No, so I think there is, paradoxically, there is some truth in those representations. They do convey the dominant message of it.
Just maybe one quick follow-up question before I move on to the other questions in the chat. You talked about the connection between central China and Xinjiang, and I was wondering about the connections between Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang and Tibet. Are these also important connections, or is everything connected to kind of central China? Do we get a maze of connections, or is it more like more linear and going outwards?
Yes, we do have a maze of connections. The road to Tibet has been asphalted. It's a comfortable road now, asphalted in its whole length. But of course, it's a geopolitically perhaps the most important road in China. It goes through the contested territory of Aksai Chin. So no wonder that it has been so well taken care of. I think it was 2015 that the road was asphalted, 2015-16. And also the connections to Inner Mongolia are asphalted. And very soon we will have a Beijing-Urumqi expressway built through Inner Mongolia. Perhaps it's already built. I would have to update my knowledge. Connecting Xinjiang via Inner Mongolia with Beijing. So a lot is going on. But yeah, as I mentioned, the question is, who is actually traveling along roads? So no one can actually travel along the road going south to Tibet. I tried to do it, but you are stopped basically 60 kilometers after the last oasis. It's a military road. It's a road built for the military. And I think the expressway currently under construction between Beijing and Urumqi, this is going to be a trade. So it's going to be a commodity transportation link, I think, for like the dominant, its main role will be for commodity transport, because many trucks are currently have to do a huge roundabout. So they have to travel, for example, from northeast China or northern China, first a bit south through Xinjiang and then back to Xinjiang. So I think a direct road through Inner Mongolia would just shorten the travel of the truck drivers by probably like 2 days. So it's always good to look at a couple of things when we analyze roads. One is the use of it, of course, and the other one is the investment. You can also learn a lot about roads from the investment. Sorry, I'm taking the time, but I find investment is a really interesting topic. So this is what I didn't look at the investment of all the roads in Xinjiang, but I looked at a few in southern Xinjiang. And so you see, for example, that county roads, village roads are built without central funding. They are built entirely by the counties and the villages themselves. And the central funding flows only into provincial roads, border roads, the roads built by the Production and Construction Corps, and the expressways. So this shows you also very nicely the hierarchy of importance and the interest, basically. So I find these documents are not easy to get your hold of, but I find looking at the finances, looking at the funding aspect of roads tells you a lot about the intention, hierarchies of importance, their intended functions, and so on. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. You mentioned briefly a military road going to Tibet, and there's a question about that aspect of things. Somebody's asking whether this better infrastructure is also a way to move the army and soldiers around. And the person gives the example of the old town in Kashgar, where the streets were widened in order to be able to bring tanks through the streets if necessary, if there was an uprising. So do you get a sense that's also an aspect of what's going on?
Oh yes, definitely. But I wouldn't limit our thinking in this area to Xinjiang only. This road that is built from between southern Xinjiang and Tibet, it's extremely important for, of course, for military purposes, but vis-a-vis India. No, this is the road along which the army, the heavy equipment can be transported in the vicinity, in the direct vicinity of the border with India, which is now, of course, of huge importance in the current India-China conflict. So on the one hand, these roads built to Xinjiang, especially the railway connection. So it's not only roads, it's also the railway connection between southern Xinjiang and the Qinghai province. This is the shortest way then for railway wagons transporting heavy military equipment to access Xinjiang, southern Xinjiang, but also to transport this equipment and people to the Indian border. So I think when we imagine such connections, it's also good to think what is beyond the border, who is there, because it also matters a lot in which roads are built and which quality they have. And then the old town of Kashgar, I didn't show any pictures from Kashgar, but the old town has changed significantly since 2011. It was, I was there for the first time, no, not for the first time, but for the first time after a long break in 2011 in Kashgar. And then Kashgar's center, old town, was in ruins. It was being pulled down. It was like probably the worst time to visit it aesthetically. And in order to be rebuilt, to construct it anew over the next years. And so, the changes are massive. We have broad streets now, a lot of air, a lot of space, a lot of sunshine. The old city was built in a way that it was built to provide shadow. And today, the broad walkways and streets, they just heat up during the days to high temperatures, because there are no walls that can shadow them. So the changes are massive in terms of infrastructure, in terms of surveillance. Cameras at every house and at every street corner. It was like this in 2016. Today, it's probably even more permeating. Yeah. Thank you. Great question.
In your discussion of preferences. You didn't mention safety. So somebody was asking whether people would feel like maybe one way of transport was safer than others, especially roads. And I know kind of road accidents are quite serious. There's quite a lot of it in China. And you mentioned people risking to fall asleep when you have a road that's very uneventful for 7 hours. So did people mention, was that kind of one of the reasons why they would choose one type of travel over another?
It didn't really come up that often in conversations about trains and roads. No, trains and planes were not really the issue of safety was not really discussed in this context, but the issue of safety was discussed a lot in terms of in the context of road travel. So what my research participants would do, or they had this amazing knowledge of which buses, for example, which long distance sleeper buses are safer than others. So they would say, don't take the 7 o'clock bus. This one is rubbish. Take the 7:30 bus. This is I don't remember now the brand, but this is a good, safe German car. This knowledge is circulating. Then, of course, in terms of car travel, this was the most feared form of travel. So there is some paradox to it as well, because on the one hand, those who can afford owning cars and paying the expressway fees, they say we prefer to travel by car than by bus. But it's always with a qualification. They say we never travel alone. So it's mostly working like this, that friends, colleagues, or family get together, 4 or 5 people, and they travel together and keep each other awake during the journeys through the desert. But yeah, it's not always working greatly. So of course, there are many bus accidents, but also extremely many car accidents. So with every family that I lived with, in every family that I lived with in Xinjiang, at least one family member, mostly young men were missing because they died in car accidents. So, and paradoxically, this enabled this opened me the doors to those families, because young men were missing there. So I, as in their eyes, unmarried person, could stay with those families. So there are those unexpected trajectories and coincidences that allow you some things. But to return to the topic, cars were on the one hand appreciated for the comfort of independence. On the other hand, they were feared. There was a clear fear of dying on the road. So people tried to diminish the risk of dying on the road by traveling together, by making breaks, by staying at family on the way, by dividing journeys into like 3-4 segments. They tried to develop strategies to go about it, but it does remain a really dangerous undertaking. And of course, the problem is that if your car breaks down in the middle of the highway section between 2 cities, then you have 200 kilometers in one direction and 200 kilometers of desert in the other direction. So until help arrives, it takes forever. So yeah, there is this ambiguity about private cars. I think flying, for those who can, they fly, but planes are, of course, also not very reliable in the climate of southern Xinjiang, where we have where half of the days throughout the year are dust days or sandstorm days, when planes don't take off. So for the moment, I think there is just no absolutely reliable means of transportation. Trains also don't go when the wind is too strong and when there is a sandstorm. So there is no 100% reliable means of transportation in southern Xinjiang yet. They will have to build tunnels or something.
I'm going to move to another question about purity and cleanliness. I'll just read the question. I was curious about the tropes of purity and cleanliness. Do you see these as primarily rooted in ethnic or religious views, as stemming from modernity discourse, as reactive displacement? For instance, you think we are dirty, so we think you are dirty. Or is it something else? Or is it a dialectic of these? And how do you interpret this sort of language and to the extent it is or it isn't offensive between the Uyghur and the Han on the bus? I think that kind of reflects the fact that people were speaking openly about the other one being dirty. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in this case, I think it really was about the ritual purity, because the food was mentioned very often in the context of dirt. So Han Chinese food is described as dirty. So I would say in this context, when Uyghurs speak, it's relating to Islamic notions of purity and cleanliness. I don't think it really has something to do. I would have to think about it longer if it has something to do with the discourse of modernity. I don't think so. With the Han, so the Han that I talked with about these concepts, what they felt was what they perceived as discomfort and dirt was related to the fact that buses in southern Xinjiang are, to a great degree, let's say 80% of passengers in the long distance buses in southern Xinjiang are Uyghur. So the Uyghur music is played on buses. Uyghur films or Uzbek films are screened on buses. The buses stop at Uyghur restaurants at the roadside, not at Chinese restaurants. So they associated the feeling of discomfort with this and with the air. So they all said the air is so bad on those long distance buses. They perceive the air to be dirty. But interestingly, also some of my Uyghur participants, research participants, said that they don't travel by bus anymore because they find the air is too dirty. So I think there are a few things flowing in or merging here together, but I would say from the Uyghur perspective, it's really very much about the ritual purity, not so much about responding to the Chinese discourse or the discourse of modernity. I don't think it was really about this. I didn't have the feeling it was about this. And I found it quite striking that this conversation on the bus that I cited, that it actually occurred in a perfectly friendly way. So the businessman first, the businessman stated what he wanted to say. And I was like, wow, you are on the bus full of Uyghurs. Do you know what you are doing here? And but the bus driver was like, okay. And then he replied to this saying that, no, you are actually you are disgusting. And then they moved to the next topic. And I remember very well what the next topic was, namely, they started to talk about the role of women in the Han and Uyghur society and how both societies should do more to appreciate women as mothers. So they could reunite in this topic of that mothers deserve more respect than they currently are given. So it's as weird as it sounds. It was really not an aggressive conversation that made anyone feel uncomfortable. There are those inexplicable things sometimes happening in the field. Thank you.
I think David has a question. David, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Thank you for such an enlightening presentation. I know that because of your own interest, you focused on transport as a category of infrastructure, But I wanted to raise something else just for general discussion, and that is urban modeling, urbanization models and infrastructure. This is something that came up in our last seminar on Xinjiang, and there was some discussion of this very interesting program of pairing cities, sister city programs, and I believe that Urumqi and Shenzhen have been paired. Clearly, this has really interesting implications for the intentions of development, I would say. And I just wonder if you've encountered that aspect of infrastructure and its social and anthropological influences.
Yes, thank you. Okay, it's Urumqi Shenzhen. I always thought it's Kashgar and the special economic zone in Kashgar that were paired with Shenzhen.
You might be right. I'm sorry. I'm not an expert on this subject.
Okay,
I just found it so interesting because that's a very pervasive source of infrastructural influence on society.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. So if I'm not wrong, I might be wrong. I thought Kashgar was paired with Shenzhen because of the special economic zone status. And so you would have, you had the special economic zone, I don't know how far, maybe 15 kilometers from Kashgar, 20 kilometers from Kashgar, I'm not sure anymore, which would be with those huge banners saying, welcome to the second Shenzhen. And then you would also have, for example, design, architecture design bureaus from Shenzhen developing designs, urban designs for Kashgar. And then in Aksu, where I conducted most of my field work, I'm just thinking, I think we were paired with Hangzhou in eastern China, so with the province of Zhejiang. I'm not even sure anymore, but I think we were paired with Hangzhou because the largest new street built in Aksu, like a boulevard, was renamed into Hangzhou Dadao, so Hangzhou Boulevard. And so yes, there is definitely a huge influence, both financial and in terms of design, between flowing in one direction, flowing in one direction, it's not flowing in both directions. Designs flowing from Eastern China to Xinjiang, and we discussed it with a number of people in Xinjiang, with our Uyghur hosts as well, and some of those designs were thought to be nice and cool and pleasant, and others were completely rejected. So in Aksu, the central square was built in the style of Eastern China, so like a large open space with 2 trees somewhere in the corner, and stony surface that reflected the light. So like during the day, it was like 60 degrees hot there, and so people didn't go there. And also in the evening, as you know, the dancing in the Han Chinese in Xinjiang introduced the dancing on public squares there, and some Uyghurs participate in those dances too in their own corner. So they go to the square to dance as well, but they do it in their own corner and in their own way. And so, for instance, the central square in Aksu, the fanciest place in the city, it was not frequented by the Uyghurs to dance or to chill in the evening. So this architectural design was rejected. And then a few others, a building, for example, that Hangzhou company, a parking house, or what would you call it? A round parking house, a very fancy thing. This one was considered modern and attractive because somehow the word around, the rumor was that it was German design, which the Hangzhou company brought to Xinjiang and transplanted onto the desert, basically. So there is definitely a flow of design from the east to Western China, flow of know-how, flow of personnel. I don't think a lot of local companies get to make money on it. I don't think maybe some subcontractors are funded with this, are able to profit from from the flow of investment along this channel, but I don't think many of them, and I'm quite sure not Uyghur companies. So it's really a one-way exchange. It's a flow of, I would say it's probably export of surplus know-how, designs, and labor for me.
Well, there's a big overhang in the construction sector already in China, and
Absolutely.
especially a few years ago. And in fact, that was a major impetus for BRI, was to be able to export those services. So they were in surplus. But do you know anything about the incentives or other inducements that are provided the Han cities for participating in this matchmaking? It's a very interesting strategy for decentralizing assimilation.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, those companies which come from Eastern China to Xinjiang and open their design bureaus or factories, they can operate tax-free in Xinjiang for, I think, 5 years, for the first 5 years. And they, at least it was like this in Aksu, they got the land either for free or for a ridiculously low lease. So I think it's a great business for the companies from Eastern China to move to Xinjiang, to branch out, because they can profit greatly from it in terms of taxes and in terms of land lease prices and infrastructure. Thank you.
We have a question about infrastructure, specifically about whether the construction companies in Xinjiang discuss the standards of roads. The person is asking whether they follow the national standard in China, whether it's the same technical standards. And did you observe any discourse related to these Chinese standards?
Yes, they follow national standards actually, but it's on paper. No, I can't talk of road construction in all of China, but in Xinjiang, as my research participants said from the government, the party, and the Academy of Social Sciences, is that you would have to actually measure the asphalt mix at every kilometer of the road, because it changes every kilometer. So the mix of asphalt and other standards, they are kept or maintained on paper, but in reality, the money that is supposed to flow into road construction flows very often in other directions. No, it flows into patronage networks, loyalty networks, and doesn't actually flow into into actual materials, technology, and labor. So I did collect quite a lot of booklets explaining national standards or describing road projects in Xinjiang in terms of those standards, projects of roads designed according to those standards, but I doubt that those standards are really maintained in actual construction. Also, even my research participants in the who have nothing to do with business of construction, are not in academia, are not in politics, they would observe simply by driving their cars that each roads in Urumqi, for example, that they are basically rebuilt. They have to be rebuilt every other year because they just crumble and fall apart, which means that the standards are not maintained, that the money that was supposed to go into the components, for example, of the asphalt mix, went somewhere else and facilitated other relationships and connections, but not necessarily travel. So I find this is also very interesting, how the money flows and which relationships it generates. We can, of course, call it corruption. No, we can do that. But I find looking a bit further is even more interesting, to see what the money that was supposed to build infrastructure is doing, which relationships it establishes, which relationships it maintains, which kind of patronage networks it flows into. It's basically, I don't know if you are familiar with the literature on in the field of infrastructure studies, but it's something that Achille Mbembe talk about the effect of doubling, that infrastructures tend to do other things than connect or link or facilitate things, that mostly there is a huge field that we don't see, that, for example, the money that flows into infrastructure projects, other fields that this money facilitates and feeds, kind of helps maintaining. So yeah, this would be perhaps the simple answer. National standards, they are there on paper, but I doubt that they are ever maintained in the actual construction.
We have a few questions about the BRI. Can you talk a little bit about what you've said between the connection between China, Eastern China, and Xinjiang within the larger context of the BRI, in terms of what things move? You know, if it's moving just beyond the idea of ethnic conflict and identity, in terms of economics, in terms of culture, art, the movements.
Yeah, I think I can't. So I was for the last time in Xinjiang in 2016, 2015 and 2016. I spent 4 months there, living basically for most of the time along one of the key connections in southern Xinjiang that lead eastwards to the province of Qinghai and further to the connecting to the national highway network and the railway network. And I have to say, I didn't see a lot of culture and art flowing along this road. What I saw were a lot of migrant workers who were coming from central China, looking for jobs in agriculture and on construction sites. So there is a lot of migration in this direction, so towards Xinjiang, migration of laborers. Then in the opposite direction, you see a lot of trucks transporting oil. There are quite a few oil extraction sites in the Taklamakan Desert. And I don't think the pipeline has been built yet, the pipeline that will also connect to Pakistan. I don't think this pipeline has been constructed yet. Anyway, in 2016, you saw a lot of trucks transporting crude oil out of Xinjiang to central China. Then in both directions, you had a lot of truck traffic. So these huge trucks, like 30-ton trucks traveling, bringing Chinese commodities. And this is just everything: mahjong tables, massage chairs, teapots, construction material, everything, windows. I think I saw basically every commodity that exists on this planet. I saw it on those trucks traveling through southern Xinjiang. So Chinese commodities from the companies and factories in central and southern China are transported on those roads to Xinjiang. But a lot of it doesn't stay in Xinjiang. That these trucks go to the border, for example, at Khorgos with Kazakhstan, where the cargo is reloaded onto the trucks, onto Kazakh trucks, which take it further to the markets across Central Asia and Northeast Asia. So the markets in Siberia, in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, they are all fed with these commodities that travel through Xinjiang, basically. Perhaps there are also other routes through Mongolia. I don't know about that. It might be that there are some routes there, but my impression was that the main route was really through Xinjiang. Also because I think many of the traders from Russia come to the big bazaars in Kazakhstan to buy those products. So those commodities. So yeah, there was a lot of traffic, but it was not cultural. There was no art traveling along it. It was rather specific. It was commodities and labor. This is what I saw traveling along these roads. And in the opposite direction from Xinjiang to central China, resources, basically. Yeah.
Right. So this increase in traffic and then increase in resource extraction, is that leading to a lot of discussions about pollution? Mm-hmm. Is that something people talk about or talked about? I mean, there's more urgent things to talk about maybe now.
Yes, they did talk about, but not very openly. So I collaborated with the geographers at the department at Xinjiang University, and of course, in these circles, environmental degradation, ecosystem degradation. It's a very present topic. So they talked about it a lot. Also, the Uyghur party cadres that I knew, it was a very important concern for them, the environment in the pre-2016 reality. But yeah, people were careful when it comes to who you talk to about it and in what way. So my colleagues at the university, they said they would never publish anything on it. So like the written word was feared. It would not be used to communicate such sensitive information. What they did instead was communicating it in orally. So they would meet and talk about these things. Or even at academic conferences or small workshops, people would talk openly about it, but no one would publish anything critical or anything that would establish a direct link between environmental degradation and Chinese companies, for example, extractive companies. You would never do that. So yeah, people did talk about it a little bit, but not very loud, I would say. Yeah, this is the thing. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I'm going to just have one more question. There's more questions they would be sent to you. So maybe there's something, if you have the time, and maybe you can follow up. Just one more question, because it's getting late in Switzerland and you've been talking for a while. So I'll just ask you, there's an interesting question about roadblocks. Of course, the situation has changed a lot in this, as you said, since 2016. But when you were there, did you have stories about how people manage the roadblocks, whether there were strategies? That would be kind of interesting, maybe point to finish on.
Yeah, there were strategies. So one of the strategies was to purchase the car through relatives that lived in northern Xinjiang, so that your car would be registered in northern Xinjiang and would have northern Xinjiang plates. The best would be plates of the capital, Urumqi. With those plates, at the time when I did my fieldwork, which is 2016, the last time, those plates would basically get you waved through many checkpoints. If you had Urumqi plates, or if you had army plates. So army plates were very expensive on the black market, because those army plates, when you had those on your car, you could just pass through the checkpoints. But with army plates, you also had to be a bit careful. And among my colleagues, only very well positioned Uyghurs dared to do it, and some Han Chinese. Because I think if it came out, I think the consequences could be very uncomfortable to the car owner. So this was also a strategy, but applied only by a few rich and well positioned among both Uyghur and Han. Then, for example, my colleague made himself a plastic, a plaque? I don't really know, thing. Not himself, but he had it made in a little workshop that said, highway authorities, expressway supervising team, or I don't know, expressway maintenance team. And he had it in the front, in the, what is it, windshield, in front window. So this also got us waved through many checkpoints. But this was also a Han colleague. It was not an Uyghur. So I think the Han, they dare to be, they dare to do things more than the Uyghurs do, because if the punishment comes, it's going to be less harsh. The Uyghurs risk much more if they engage in this kind of creative negotiation of exclusion, or so. Yeah, so it was there. Then another strategy was not to look up at the policeman. This was a strategy that the Uyghurs applied at checkpoints. So you looked down and handed the documents to the policeman, and you waited to get back those documents. You got them back. Looking down, you move forward and left the checkpoint, hopefully. So not engaging, not challenging the authorities, but like really just disappearing and hoping that you will somehow get through. So this was the strategy that my research participants applied to. And then another strategy that some of the bus drivers applied was just driving through the desert and around checkpoints, so that they don't have to wait and they don't have to pay. So they did it also around the toll stations. So yeah, like different groups develop different strategies, I think you could say. And this would be just a few examples. People are creative, so there would be other ways. Or what happened to me, perhaps as just the last information, sometimes it's worth waiting until 5 or 6 in the evening and driving through the checkpoint then, because China is a bureaucratic country. So at 5 or 6, all the officers have to go home to eat and sleep. So it happened to me that I was trying to get through a checkpoint during the day, and it didn't work out. I was sent back, and then the taxi driver who was driving the taxi in which I was, he said, we return when they are gone. And so we returned at 7 in the evening, and both checkpoints were empty, and we could just drive through. So I think it's good to listen to the people who have the local knowledge of the place, because they can navigate checkpoints and other difficulties along the way much better than we do. We just can't do it. We don't have the knowledge that is necessary to do it in this kind of creative way.
Though maybe now it's probably more difficult to do these kind of things in recent years. And then also maybe the introduction of artificial intelligence and automatic recognition, that's also must complicate the situation.
Yes. Yeah. Of course, already in 2016, there was your ID was checked at every checkpoint, and Han Chinese didn't have to sometimes show even their IDs. They would be just waved through, and the Uyghurs were thoroughly checked, and the foreigners too. So also this has changed, I thought, to previous years, that we were really checked very thoroughly. So sometimes I really had to spend an hour or an hour and a half at the checkpoint, and you saw that they were not doing anything. The officers were not doing anything with my passport. It was only to show or to teach me a lesson, or to make me wait, basically. So yeah, this also changed. So you saw that also the attitudes towards the foreigners, or the presence of the foreigners, was very undesired. Yeah, unwished for. Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll stop here. I thank you again for this amazing talk. I learned so much.
Thank you very much.
This has been recorded, and it will be posted on the website in about 2 to 3 weeks' time. Thank you, Agnieszka.
Thank you very much, and have a good day. I think the day is just beginning in California, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.